Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're continuing with our ongoing series entitled Recurring Themes in the QME Evaluation. And in this series, we're reviewing some of the common situations, scenarios, and circumstances that you're going to encounter over and over and over again in your career as a qualified medical evaluator. And we spent some time at the beginning of this series talking about the recurring themes related to industrial causation, and we explored such topics as the unwitnessed incident, as topics such as a delay in reporting of the industrial injury, and we explored those themes related to your AOE COE determination that you're going to be called upon to make in many of your cases, especially those cases that involve the denied cases. Then we talked about recurring themes in the interview process with your examinee, and we explored some new research related to how to determine the veracity of your examinee's subjective statements. In other words, we went through a series of procedures to determine if your examinee has a tendency to be a truth teller, or whether or not the examinee has a tendency to employ hyperbole or even outright fabrications in the testimony that they share with you in the face-to-face evaluation. And that was an extremely valuable session and contains some ideas in that session that you'll be able to use with every single examinee from now until the conclusion of your career as a qualified medical evaluator. We then turned our attention to recurring themes related to the medical treatment that the examinees that you're going to encounter have been put through. And we talked about examinees and the unique circumstance of examinees who find themselves pursuing medical treatment outside of the medical provider network. And this is a major red flag for workers' compensation fraud that appears to be especially prevalent in Southern California, but is also creeping its way into Northern California as well. And examinees who pursue medical treatment outside of the medical provider network generally represent those denied cases that have been denied because the claims administrator is not convinced that the examinee suffered a bona fide incident of injury. So the claims examiner denies the claim, and the examinee then has no option but to pursue treatment either with their primary care physician or through a series of physicians and providers who agree to provide medical treatment and who agree to provide diagnostic studies and who agree to provide physical therapy, chiropractic treatment, pain management treatments, all on a lien basis. So we talked about how to identify this type of examinee when you encounter them. We also talked about recurring themes in the medical treatment wherein examinees fail to cooperate with the prescribed medical treatment program. And this happens more often than you can imagine. And examinees are both subtle and profound in the ways that they find to object to medical treatment procedures. And this runs the gamut all the way from refusing to take medications to refusing to comply with instructions to lie still and motionless in the MRI tube, and many other examples of ways that examinees confound the medical treatment process and thereby end up at the permanent impairment evaluation with you complaining of ongoing subjective complaints and activity limitations because the medical treatment has failed to bring them back to pre-injury status. And part of the reason for that is because the examinee failed to comply with the prescribed treatment program. And that brings us to today's discussion and our next couple of discussions. And I want to talk to you about recurring themes in the permanent impairment determination. Now, you need to remember that examinees who end up with a permanent impairment rating are examinees who have failed to recover to pre-injury status. These are examinees who have suffered injury significant enough that the injury did not fully respond to the medical treatment program, and the examinee is left with some residua short of a full return to pre-injury status. Well, in my experience and in the experience of hundreds of doctors who are subscribers to my weekly broadcasts, most examinees who end up at the permanent impairment evaluation have fully recovered to pre-injury status. Now, examinees will continue to report ongoing symptoms and activity limitations to you in the face-to-face evaluation. However, close interview regarding activities of daily living and meticulous physical examination procedures both will indicate to you that the examinee, number one, does not have true limitations with activities of daily living, and number two, the examinee does not have true objective findings on physical examination to support a permanent impairment rating. So the recurring theme is that examinees will continue to report ongoing symptoms and activity limitations, and the recurring theme is that you as the qualified medical evaluator will have a tendency to overrate their permanent impairment rating, both under the strict application of the AMA guides. You'll have a tendency to overrate it. And then also, certainly by employing alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman, you will have a tendency to further continue to overinflate, sometimes in duplicate, sometimes in triplicate, sometimes quadrupling, and even quintupling the permanent impairment rating that's provided for by the strict application of the AMA guides. And so your examinees will end up with an inflated and elevated and escalated permanent impairment rating when in actuality they have no true permanent impairment rating because the medical treatment has successfully returned them to their pre-injury condition. So today I want to talk to you about permanent impairment ratings, both under the strict application of the AMA guides and under Almarez and Guzman through the use of alternative impairment ratings. And the principle of today's discussion is that in the majority of cases where examinees have true permanent impairment, and I place emphasis on true permanent impairment, meaning they have true and actual limitations to activities of daily living, and they have true and actual positive objective findings on physical examination. In the majority of these cases, 99% of these cases, you can confidently and comfortably and accurately rate their permanent impairment under the strict application of the AMA guides. Only in the rare circumstance will you need to go through the four corners of the AMA guides to find a permanent impairment rating more accurate than the strict impairment rating. And we'll talk about why that is. The reason that doctors use alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman has become clarified in the courts. And when Almarez and Guzman cases were first being heard, the courts admonished qualified medical evaluators from going through what they referred to as a fishing expedition through the AMA guides to obtain a more favorable or a more desirable result. Well, it's now known that really the only reason to use alternative ratings under Almarez and Guzman is to provide a higher permanent impairment rating than is provided for by the AMA guides. Now, alternative ratings under Almarez and Guzman also allow us to provide for lower permanent impairment ratings than are provided for by the strict application of the AMA guides, but I've never ever seen a single case wherein a doctor employed an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman that provided a lower permanent impairment rating than the strict rating. Doctors employ alternative ratings under Almarez and Guzman simply to achieve a better result, which is a higher permanent impairment rating. Now, it's important that you understand, and we're going to illustrate it in today's case examples, that alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman are rarely upheld by the court, either by the workers' compensation judge or on appeal by the WCAB. And the reason that alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman are rarely upheld is because the QME's opinion for the alternative impairment rating seldom, if ever, qualifies as substantial medical evidence. So today we're going to review what is required for your alternative impairment rating to qualify as substantial medical evidence so that it will be an opinion that is upheld by the judges and by the courts should you decide to employ an alternative impairment rating to more accurately describe the examinee's impairment. So to begin, I want to read a couple of citations to you from the Guzman 2 decision, which gives us our basis for employing the alternative impairment ratings and also gives us instructions as to how we are to employ those alternative impairment ratings in cases that truly are not accurately described in the particular chapter, chart, or table within the AMA guides. So just a couple citations from the Guzman 2 decision, and this is from August 19th, 2010. The Guzman decision states that in order to support a case for rebuttal, meaning a rebuttal of the strict impairment rating under the AMA guides, a physician has to be permitted to explain why a departure from the impairment percentages was necessary and how he or she arrived at a different rating. And this is the reason that alternative impairment ratings are seldom upheld, because the physicians fail to explain why a departure from the standard or strict impairment rating was necessary, and they fail to explain how he or she arrived at a different rating. And what we're going to see is that in applying alternative ratings under Almarez and Guzman, the threshold for substantial medical evidence is very high. It's a tall threshold for your opinion for an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman to qualify as substantial medical evidence. And for that reason, most qualified medical evaluators cannot provide an opinion that is substantial medical evidence to support a higher alternative impairment rating. See, it's one thing to provide an alternative impairment rating. That's easy to do. Anyone can do that. Anyone can go through a fishing expedition through the AMA guides and come up with an alternative rating that's higher than the strict rating. That's easy. The hard part is in qualifying that opinion for the higher rating as substantial medical evidence. And in most cases, it's impossible to do. And for that reason, the doctor's opinion for the higher rating is seldom, if ever, upheld by the judges and the courts. And I have 3 examples that I want to share with you today wherein the doctor was unable to explain why a departure was necessary and was unable to explain why and how he or she arrived at a different rating. Okay, so that's the first citation I want to share with you. Second one, we know that a physician can utilize any chapter, any table, or any method in the AMA guides that most accurately reflects the injured employee's impairment, but we're not permitted to go outside of the 4 corners of the AMA guides. So that's new. Prior to the Guzman 2 decision, we were able to use outside references and outside sources and outside citations, but now we're limited to the 4 corners of the AMA guides. Now, the courts emphasize that its decision does not allow a physician to conduct a fishing expedition through the guides simply to achieve a desired result. And we know that why else would you provide an alternative impairment rating if it didn't provide a higher impairment rating than the strict rating? If the strict rating provided the higher impairment rating, well, then doctors would argue that that was the most accurate description and that an alternative rating would not be necessary. So if you're going to provide a higher impairment rating, the higher impairment rating and your opinion has to qualify as substantial medical evidence, and therein lies the difficulty. It says the physician's medical opinion must constitute substantial medical evidence of whole person impairment, and therefore it must set forth the facts and the reasoning that justify it. In order to constitute substantial evidence, a medical opinion must be predicated on reasonable medical probability. A medical opinion is not substantial evidence if it is based on facts no longer germane, on inadequate medical histories or examinations, on incorrect legal theories, or on surmise, speculation, conjecture, or guess. Further, a medical report is not substantial evidence unless it sets forth the reasoning behind the physician's opinion, not merely his or her conclusions. And most doctors err, E-R-R, or err, in their alternative impairment ratings because they fail to set forth the reasons in support, the reasons and the reasoning in support of their conclusion. They simply provide the conclusion, which is the higher alternative impairment rating, but they don't provide the reasoning behind the conclusion, and generally the reason for that is because there is no reasoning behind the conclusion. The physician is merely fishing through the AMA guides to achieve a desired result. And this sticks out like a sore thumb, and it's never, never, never upheld by the judges and the courts. A couple more citations. They state that simply presenting a view contrary to an established rating in the guides would not be sufficient to rebut the strict application of the AMA guides. As discussed earlier, an impairment rating that is inadequately supported by evidence and reasoning, and unquestionably a rebuttal position, an alternative impairment rating, arrived at by hunting through the guides for a more favorable rating, will result in an opinion from the workers' comp judge that he or she will necessarily reject as insufficient evidence. So, what then qualifies your opinion under Almarez and Guzman, your alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman? What qualifies it as substantial medical evidence? Well, as I said earlier, the threshold for this is quite tall. Number one, any impairment rating, whether it be a strict impairment rating or an alternative rating under Almarez and Guzman, has to first and foremost qualify as substantial medical evidence. Now, substantial medical evidence was described in the Escobedo case. And I believe I have that. We just made a couple of references to the Escobedo case here, in that it cannot be based on surmise, conjecture, or speculation. It cannot be based on an inadequate medical history. It must be based on reasonable medical probability. So it must qualify as substantial medical evidence based on all the criteria described in Escobedo. And that applies to any impairment rating that you provide, whether it be a strict rating or an alternative rating. And then number two, and here's where the threshold gets even higher. Number two, when you provide an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, that alternative impairment rating must satisfy 4 additional criteria in order to qualify as substantial medical evidence. And the 4 additional criteria are, number 1, that the physician must first provide an impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides. So you must go through the whole exercise of determining the permanent impairment under the strict application of the guides. That's number 1. Then number 2, the physician must set forth an explanation as to why the permanent impairment rating as it exists under the strict application of the guides, why that permanent impairment rating is not an accurate reflection of the examinee's true impairment. Now, this is, of course, going to be quite difficult to do. Number 3, the physician must then provide an alternative impairment rating by using any chart, any table, any chapter, any method within the 4 corners of the AMA guides. And then number 4, and most difficult of all, the physician must explain why the alternative impairment rating is a more accurate and is the most accurate description of the examinee's true impairment. And it's steps number 2 and steps number 4 wherein most qualified medical evaluators fall short. And the reason they fall short is because they're unable to explain why. Let me say that again. They're unable to explain why the alternative impairment rating that they provided is more accurate than the impairment rating provided by the guides. Physicians generally have no problem with step number 1, which is providing the strict rating, and number 3, which is providing the alternative rating. The difficulty comes in explaining steps number 2 and steps number 4, which is why the strict rating is not accurate, and number 4, why the alternative rating is the most accurate. In other words, the physician's opinion on an alternative impairment rating rarely ever constitutes substantial medical evidence, because even though the physician can provide the opinion, can provide the conclusory opinion, he can give us the conclusion of the alternative rating percentage, he cannot support it with how and why reasoning. The physician cannot explain why the alternative impairment rating is more accurate. He can explain why the alternative impairment rating is higher. In other words, he produces a desired outcome of a higher impairment rating, but he cannot explain why the alternative impairment rating is a more accurate description of the examinee's true impairment. And for that reason, alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman are rarely, if ever, upheld. Because in order to shoot down an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, all the defense has to do is suggest and prove that the doctor did not comply with the 4 requirements of qualifying his opinion as substantial medical evidence. And an opinion that is not substantial cannot be upheld by the courts. So in order to demonstrate these principles, I want to go through 3 cases with you, 3 fascinating cases that perfectly illustrate how the qualified medical evaluator failed to support his opinion as to why the alternative impairment rating was more accurate than the strict rating, and of course the judge was unable to uphold the alternative impairment rating, deferring instead for the strict rating under the AMA guides. So the first case I want to share with you is Constantino versus Queen's Care. And in this case, the workers' comp judge found that the examinee suffered 70% disability as a result of an injury to Miss Constantino's back, right shoulder, and psyche. Now, the defendant, the defense attorney, the insurance company, and the claims administrator objected to this, and they sought reconsideration of that finding for 70% permanent disability. The In finding for 70% disability, the workers' comp judge initially found that the applicant had successfully rebutted the AMA guides with an alternative impairment rating. So the alternative impairment rating was initially upheld by the workers' comp judge, but the defendant sought reconsideration of the findings and award. And the workers' comp appeals board granted reconsideration and took another look at the matter. The defendant contended that the workers' comp judge erred in finding permanent disability of 70%. They argued that the workers' comp judge erred in finding that the scheduled AMA whole person impairment rating was successfully rebutted pursuant to Guzman. In other words, they argued that the QME's opinion on an alternative impairment rating did not qualify as substantial medical evidence. Well, the Workers' Compensation Board stated that we agree with defendant that the workers' comp judge erred in finding that applicant rebutted the scheduled AMA guides impairment rating. We therefore will grant reconsideration, will issue a new decision which calculates the applicant's permanent disability by using applicant's scheduled AMA guides low back rating. So in this case, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board reversed the decision of the workers' comp judge for the higher impairment rating under Almarez Guzman and lowered the impairment rating back to the strict rating provided for by the AMA guides because the QME's opinion did not qualify as substantial medical evidence. So the case involved an orthopedic AME, and the AME described his permanent impairment rating as follows. He says, this patient is status post-fusion at 2 levels of the spine. Per table 15.3, this patient is a DRE lumbar category 5 for fusion at 2 levels of the spine. So, in addition to the impairment rating for DRE category 5, the QME said, in considering activities of daily living with regard to the DRE method, I would provide a 28% whole person impairment. So the QME or AME increased the permanent impairment rating from 25% under table 15.3 to 28%, the higher value within the range. The range is 25 to 28%. So the evaluator provided for 3% additional whole person impairment as a discretionary impairment due to some sort of impact of this condition on activities of daily living, although he doesn't state what the impact is. He says, in addition, I would add 3 points for pain, resulting in a 31% whole person impairment. Now, I would argue that this formulation of permanent impairment uses a discretionary rating of 3% twice, one for consideration of pain and one for consideration of activities of daily living, which appears to me to be duplicative. In other words, it employs the discretionary 3% add-on twice. But anyway, under the strict application of the AMA guides, the evaluator rated the spinal injury at 31% whole person impairment. Okay? Now herein he provides his alternative impairment rating, and he says, considering the Almarez Guzman 2 decision, I do not feel that the impairment using the standard AMA guides rating system is accurate. The guides do not take into consideration pain or subjective factors and does not take into consideration work restrictions or inability to resume the pre-injury occupation. And then he provides the alternative impairment rating by stating, from figure 1519, the lumbar spine has a maximal 90% whole person impairment. In other words, if you had 100% loss of function of the entirety of the lumbar spine, that would be a 90% whole person impairment. He says this patient has lost 50% of her pre-injury capacity for use of the lumbar spine. Using the Almarez Guzman 2 decision, this patient has a 45% whole person impairment, which includes the pain rating. Now, of the 4 steps to qualify an opinion for alternative impairment under Almarez and Guzman, this evaluator did 2 steps. He provided a strict rating, he provided an alternative rating. However, he failed on steps number 2 and steps number 4. He failed to state why the strict rating was not accurate, and he failed to state why the alternative impairment rating was more accurate. But he was successful in increasing the impairment rating from 31% to 45%, an increase of 14% whole person impairment. This evaluator attempted to provide a higher impairment rating, but was unable, in his own words, to support the higher impairment rating. Well, the court, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board, explained that in order to constitute substantial evidence, a medical opinion must be predicated on reasonable medical probability. Nowhere did the evaluator's opinion use those words. He did not base his opinion on reasonable medical probability. Also, a medical opinion is not substantial evidence if it's based on facts no longer germane, on inadequate medical histories or examinations, on incorrect legal theories, or on surmise, speculation, conjecture, or guess. Further, a medical report is not substantial evidence unless it sets forth the reasoning behind the physician's opinion, not merely his or her conclusion. And in providing the alternative impairment rating, this evaluator simply provided the conclusion. He didn't provide the reasoning. So, what's the decision? What's the decision? In applying these principles to the doctor's report, we find that the AMA guide's impairment was not successfully rebutted. The doctor does not sufficiently explain why applicant's impairment is not adequately reflected by the AMA guides. That's step number 2. He failed in step number 2. Additionally, Table 1519 of the AMA guides provides information on how to convert a whole person impairment to a regional estimate of spinal impairment. The table is not intended to be used as a rating mechanism, and neither the applicant nor the medical evaluator specify where the rating method utilized is outlined in the guides. So the doctor simply went on a fishing expedition through charts and tables and came up with his own methods to rate the impairment that he was not able to support in any way with substantial evidence. Accordingly, we find that the scheduled AMA rating was not properly rebutted, and we rate the applicant's impairment using the scheduled rating. Interesting. So it's quite easy to provide an alternative impairment rating. We could do that all day long on every single case by using other charts, tables, and chapters in the guides. But it's supporting that alternative impairment rating that is extremely, extremely difficult. And for that reason, alternative impairment ratings are rarely upheld, and the applicant is generally rated under the strict application of the AMA guides. Okay? Now, in another example, the Kramer versus the County of Sonoma, the qualified medical evaluator attempted to provide an elevated, higher impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, but was unable to support it. States that the defendant, meaning the defense attorney or the claims administrator, seeks reconsideration of the findings and award by a workers' compensation judge who found that applicant sustained industrial injury to her left ankle, which caused 25% permanent disability after apportionment. So under the alternative impairment rating, the workers' comp judge provided for 25% permanent disability. But the defendant raised their hand and said, hey, this alternative impairment rating is not substantial medical evidence. The defendant contends that the workers' comp judge erred in awarding 25% permanent disability because the Almarez Guzman opinion of the agreed medical evaluator did not constitute substantial medical evidence. And let me give you the facts behind this case. Now, this is fascinating because in going from the strict application of the AMA guides to the alternative impairment rating under Almarez Guzman, the impairment rating quadruples. It goes from 10% whole person impairment under the strict application of the guides to 40% under the alternative impairment rating. Now, this is for a lower extremity injury. Recall that complete amputation of one lower extremity qualifies for 40% whole person impairment. This examinee had an injury to the left ankle, and by using an alternative impairment rating, the evaluator provided an impairment rating equivalent to complete amputation of the entire lower extremity. Well, that's easy to do, but it's difficult to support. So here's the permanent impairment opinion of the agreed medical evaluator. He says, it's my opinion, using the AMA guides, that she would be best rated using gait impairment. I'm sorry, this is the alternative impairment rating. He's going to contrast that with the strict rating. He says she would be best rated using gait impairment, noting that she uses a walker, which is equivalent to using 2 canes or 2 crutches. Therefore, she would be offered a 40% whole person impairment rating referencing Table 17.5, which is the gait derangement table in Chapter 17. 40%. He says, in the alternative, she could be rated referencing Table 17.26 with ankle impairment due to ankylosis in a valgus position. She has valgus ankylosis of the ankle, which provides for 10% whole person impairment since the valgus positioning is approximately 150 degrees. Okay? So he's now provided the 2 impairment ratings. He satisfied steps number 1 and steps number 3. Here he tries to justify his opinion or support his opinion. He says this examiner would favor using the gait derangement, noting that the patient has an attempted pantalar arthrodesis, which is a fusion of the tibio-talar joint as well as the subtalar joint. This would result in a significant gait abnormality that is not accounted for entirely by a simple ankylosis measurement. Now, when you have an ankylosis of the ankle joint, what does that impairment encompass? Does that encompass pain? Yes. Does that encompass weakness? Yes. Does that encompass difficulty walking with an ankylosed joint? Yes. Gait derangement is subsumed under the strict impairment rating of the AMA guides. In other words, when you have an ankylosis of your ankle joint, how does that affect you for activities of daily living? That's going to affect your gait, correct? So the gait derangement is subsumed in the impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides. But he says that this would result in a significant gait abnormality that is not accounted for entirely by a simple ankylosis measurement, and so therefore he provides for permanent impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman for 40% equivalent to amputation due to gait derangement. In a supplemental report, the defense attorney wrote to the agreed medical evaluator, and the defense attorney pointed out that this level of disability exceeds that provided for an amputation level of the lower leg. He says, the defense attorney is correct that before I resort to table 17.5, which is the gait derangement table, I should, whenever possible, use a different rating. In other words, gait derangement should only be used when a more specific method is not possible. Obviously, I can appropriately rate Miss Kramer referencing arthrodesis with valgus deformity. Table 1726 rates impairment due to ankylosis in a valgus position and offers up to 10% whole person impairment. And here the doctor shoots himself in the foot and he says, I used the gait derangement impairment primarily because I felt she deserved a higher rating. Not because the gait derangement impairment was more accurate, a more accurate description of the impairment. He says, I used the gait derangement impairment primarily because I felt she deserved a higher rating. He says, obviously the defense attorney is correct that in part her gait derangement is a consequence of other factors such as obesity and her diabetic peripheral neuropathy. Therefore, I agree with him that it may be appropriate to consider rating her using the more specific rating of a valgus ankylosis at 10%. Yet, he says, when one steps back and looks at the overall level of her current disability as a consequence of the injury, the level of disability of 10% is fairly low. I don't know why the doctor opines that 10% is fairly low. It's fairly low compared to what? But then he further shoots himself in the foot and he says, I will leave it up to the trier of fact to decide whether or not the Almarez Guzman decision may apply to my rating or not. So the doctor fails to support any reason, he fails to provide any reason in support of his use of a 40% whole person impairment rating compared to the 10% offered under the strict application of the guides. In other words, he quadruples the impairment rating without any explanation or any support to it whatsoever. And it's my opinion, it's probably because he didn't believe that the examinee actually qualified for the higher rating because he was unable to provide any support at all for his conclusion. He probably didn't really believe it in his heart. That's why he couldn't support the conclusion. Well, the court summarized this case by stating, to properly rate using Almarez and Guzman, the doctor is expected, number one, to provide a strict rating per the AMA guides. He did that. 2, explain why the strict rating does not accurately reflect the applicant's disability. 3, provide an alternative rating using the 4 corners of the AMA guides. He did that. And number 4, explain why that alternative rating most accurately reflects applicant's level of disability. And that he did not do. Although the doctor provided a strict rating for the applicant's injury, he did not explain whether applicant's strict rating adequately reflected her level of disability. Although he provided an alternative rating using the 4 corners of the AMA guides, he did not explain why the alternative rating most accurately reflects applicant's level of disability. Instead, the evaluator leaves that determination to the trier of fact. However, it is the physician's role to assess whole person impairment by a report that sets forth facts and reasoning to support its conclusion. Here, the evaluator improperly delegated that role to the workers' comp judge. Without medical evidence to support which of the 2 proposed disability ratings is most accurate, the trier of fact cannot make a determination on applicant's level of permanent disability. For these reasons, the agreed medical evaluator's opinion is not substantial medical evidence. And the recurring theme is that permanent impairment ratings are largely overinflated using alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman. And they're very rarely upheld because they can't be supported by substantial medical evidence. So 99% of the cases that you'll ever encounter that result in permanent impairment, okay, in those rare cases where your examinee has true permanent impairment, okay, which is the exception rather than the rule, those cases can be accurately rated using the strict application of the AMA guides. And if you're going to use an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, it has to qualify as substantial medical evidence, and your reasoning has to be good, has to be good. It has to be true. It has to be actual. It has to be supported by facts and reasoning. It has to actually be true. And the qualifiers of substantial medical evidence are like filters. They're like filters in a funnel that the opinion must drop through. And if that opinion finally drops through the bottom of the funnel, it's because it's passed through the filters, and it makes it an opinion that's substantial. A substantial opinion basically is an opinion that's a true opinion, which is very, very difficult to support with alternative impairment ratings. Okay, finally, this is a great case, has to do with upper extremity hand injury. The Allred versus RST Cranes case involved an examinee who had a crush injury to the middle and ring fingers. Crush injury to the middle and ring fingers. So in this case, the workers' comp judge initially found for 31% permanent disability using an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman. Of course, the defendant objected to this, and the defendant seeks reconsideration of the findings and award, wherein the workers' comp judge found that applicant sustained injury arising out of and occurring in the course of employment to his left, middle, and ring fingers that caused 31% disability. Defendant contends that the workers' comp judge erred in finding that applicant sustained 31% disability, arguing that that decision is not based on substantial medical evidence because the PQME did not provide a rationale for deviating from a strict AMA guides rating. This is a recurring theme. Qualified medical evaluators struggle to support their opinion for an alternative impairment rating because it's clear that they're simply trying to achieve a better result. And most cases can be accurately rated under the strict application of the AMA guides. So, applicant sustained a crush injury to his left, middle, and ring fingers. He saw a panel QME. The QME opined that the applicant had 4% whole person impairment. Okay, on initial evaluation, the PQME opined for 4% whole person impairment under the strict application of the guides. And in that report, he stated that with reference to Almarez Guzman, no other chapter or section would be more appropriate. So on the first evaluation, the evaluator did evaluation of the ring and middle fingers. He came up first with finger impairments, certain percentage of finger impairments, probably based on loss of range of motion. He then converted those finger impairments to hand impairments. He converted the hand impairment percentage to an upper extremity impairment percentage. And then using table 16.3, he converted the upper extremity impairment percentage into a whole person impairment percentage. It came in at 4%, whole person. And he felt that an alternative impairment rating was not necessary. Well, what happens when you do that? You very soon start to get some letters from the applicant attorney. And the applicant attorney states, 2 months later, he says, I have now received a request for a supplemental report. I'm being asked to reconsider the impairment based also on sensory loss, grip strength, as well as peripheral nerve or vascular impairment. In other words, he received a letter from the applicant attorney asking him to elevate or escalate the permanent impairment rating from 4% to something more substantial. So he tries to do it. He tries to satisfy the parties, and he tries to come up with an alternative impairment rating. He says it's true that the patient has significant injuries to his left, third, and fourth fingers and has difficulty using them in any type of normal fashion. He says page 499, table 1618, does note maximum impairment values. I don't think you can see this, but this is table 1618, and it describes the maximum impairment value for the middle finger if it's amputated, completely lost the entire finger, at 11% whole person impairment, and the ring finger, the entire finger, if it's amputated, provides for 5% impairment. Now, previously he opined for 4% for these two fingers combined. Now he's referencing an alternative rating using table 1618. He says the maximum impairment value for a third or middle finger, the entire finger, would be 11% whole person. The maximum value for an entire ring finger would be 5% whole person impairment. If this maximum impairment value is used, in other words, if we consider that those two fingers were basically amputated and he has absolutely no function at all of those two fingers, it would qualify for 11% and 5%. It says if this maximum impairment value is used, then there would be no further impairment for sensory loss, grip and pinch strength, weakness, or peripheral nerve or vascular impairment. He says, given the significant injury Mr. Almarez suffered, it is felt. He says, it is felt. I don't know what that means. It is felt. Who felt it? Who felt it? It is felt. That's the passive tense versus the active tense. He says, it is felt, in considering Almarez Guzman, that this would be an appropriate rating impairment. The previously given impairment of 4%, that is, that I provided would be considered the strict interpretation of the guides. He says, I would now modify my report, and considering Almarez Guzman, that the 11% whole person impairment for the middle finger and 5% whole person impairment for the ring finger be combined for a 16% whole person impairment. The previously given 3% for pain would remain unchanged, as previously noted. So here, on the urging of the applicant attorney, the qualified medical evaluator elevates his permanent impairment rating from 4% under the strict application of the AMA guides when he said that no alternative impairment rating was necessary, from 4% to 16%, a quadrupling of the permanent impairment rating with no explanation as to why the strict rating is not accurate and no explanation as to why the alternative rating is more accurate. So the court here says that not all medical opinion constitutes substantial evidence, and this is an opinion that is certainly not substantial evidence. They state, the PQME did not state that applicant's condition is not covered by the guides or that it was not adequately addressed by the diagnostic criteria in the guides. The doctor did not address whether and to what extent the applicant has difficulty with activities of daily living. Although the evaluator states that applicant has difficulty using the injured fingers in any type of normal fashion, and it appears that applicant has sustained a significant injury, Dr. Wilson's reporting is insufficient on the issue of applicant's level of permanent disability. So for that reason, they were unable to use the alternative impairment rating under the AMA guides. And why is it that the doctor was unable to provide an explanation as to why the alternative impairment rating was more accurate than the strict rating? Is because, let's speculate as to what some of those reasons could be. Is it possible that the doctor didn't actually believe it to be true? I mean, he did state in his first report that an alternative impairment rating was not necessary. It was only after urging by the applicant attorney that he elevated the permanent impairment rating by going through other charts and tables and chapters to come up with an impairment rating 4 times quadruple the initial impairment rating, but he actually didn't believe it to be true. He actually could not come up with reasons to support his opinions. His opinion did not qualify as substantial medical evidence. And therein is the difficulty that qualified medical evaluators encounter when attempting to provide higher permanent impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman. Those higher permanent impairment ratings are very, very difficult to support with an opinion that qualifies as substantial medical evidence. So if you come into a case wherein you opine that an alternative impairment rating is more accurate than the strict rating, you must go through the 4 steps in qualifying that opinion as substantial medical evidence. And if that opinion makes it through those filters and falls out the bottom of the funnel intact, then you can be confident that the opinion is an accurate representation of the examinee's true permanent impairment, because the opinion qualifies as substantial medical evidence and it meets all the criteria required by the courts to be used in settling the case on a final basis. So, doctors, I hope this helps you. The principle of this discussion is that most examinees successfully complete their treatment programs and return to a pre-injury status. However, most examinees, whether they fully recover to pre-injury status or not, will present to the qualified medical evaluation reporting ongoing symptoms and activity limitations. You can count on this. It's just the nature of the type of work that we do. Well, close interview and close physical examination will review that most examinees have no true limitations to activities of daily living and have no true positive objective findings on physical examination, and on that basis do not qualify for permanent impairment. They have no permanent impairment. In those rare cases where the examinee is left with residua and does have true limitations to activities of daily living and does have true positive objective findings on physical exam, you can accurately rate that permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides. Now, if you feel that that strict application is not accurate and there's another permanent impairment rating within the 4 corners of the AMA guides that more accurately describes the examinee's permanent impairment, you can comfortably and confidently use that alternative rating, but the opinion must qualify as substantial medical evidence. And when you go through the 4-step procedure of qualifying that opinion as substantial medical evidence, if it survives those 4 filters, if your opinion survives those 4 filters, then you can feel comfortable and confident that you've provided a true permanent impairment rating that's a true and accurate representation of the examinee's actual condition. But in most cases, the permanent impairment rating provided for under the strict application of the AMA guides is going to be perfectly adequate and perfectly accurate. So doctors, I hope this helps you. We're talking about recurring themes in the qualified medical evaluation, and this is certainly a scenario that you're going to face with every single examinee, because every single examinee will come to the final evaluation with you and complain of ongoing symptoms and activity limitations. And here I've given you several steps as to how to handle it from that point forward. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. Look forward to being with you on future sessions as well. And for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.